Hi and welcome back to my channel. My name is Priya from Petals by Priya Watercolor Designs, and today's tutorial is all about how to paint this simple but beautiful watercolor greenery wreath. I posted this photo on my Instagram a while back and had tons of requests to make a tutorial for it, so I'm so happy to finally be able to share that with you today. I want to give a special thanks to Princeton Artist Brushes for partnering with me on this video and supplying my absolute favorite brushes, as well as the Daler-Rowney Aquafine Watercolor Paint and Arches 100% cotton paper. So the supplies you'll need include watercolor paper, and as I said, I'll be using Arches 100% cotton paper. You'll also need a few different mid-sized round brushes. I will primarily be using size 4 and 6 from the Princeton Velvet Touch and Heritage series, and I might also use size 2 from the Aqua Elite series as well for some of the smaller filler leaves. You'll also need a jar of clean water, a paper towel for dabbing excess water from your brush, a mixing palette to gather your colors, a pencil for tracing the circle and sketching out the leaves, and of course watercolor paints. Like I said before, I'm using the Daler-Rowney Aquafine Watercolor Paint tubes, and specifically I'll be using a mixture of the Hooker's Green Dark and then just a touch of Burnt Sienna to get a nice earthy green color. So I'm going to just do a little test swatch on this piece of scrap paper just to see how the color's looking. It's looking pretty good. It's a nice earthy color that I was hoping for. No worries at all if you don't have these exact colors. You'll just want to choose 1 or 2 shades of green that you have at home and that you like to work with. Now before we start sketching out the wreath, I just want to practice painting 1 or 2 leaves on this piece of scrap paper so you can get the hang of the wet on wet technique that we'll be using to give the leaves a little bit more depth. So first up, you want to load up your brush. Again, I'm using this size 6 round brush from Princeton Heritage. You want to load up your brush with a very light value of your green. So you can get a lighter wash or lighter value of your color by just adding more water to your mixture and just diluting some of that pigment out. Now once you have your brush loaded up with a good amount of that light value green, we're just going to start by using the very tip of your brush to create the leaf stem, and then applying some pressure down on the paper to actually paint the leaf shape. And again, this is just a practice round, so don't worry too much about creating the perfect leaf. We're just practicing. Okay, so make sure you have a nice even layer of water. You don't want it to be pooling up in any areas because that can create some harsh dry lines. But you also want to have enough water on there that we can get some nice bleeds and blooms when we apply the second layer. So make sure it's a nice, thin, even layer, and then load up your brush with a medium value of that green, so just slightly darker than the value that we just did, and just gently tap it in along the edge of the leaf. And you'll see the paint starts to bloom, which is my favorite part of the wet on wet technique. Now I'm rinsing off my brush and dabbing it on my paper towel. This is a little bit too contrasted for me. I want that to be a smoother blend between the light and the darker green. So I rinsed off my brush, dabbed it on the paper towel, and I'm just gently feathering that out so I can get a softer transition. Alright, that's looking pretty good, and I'm going to go in even with one last layer, so I'm getting a really dark value of the green now. And I'm just going to do that same exact process along the edge of the leaf and down the stem. And once again, I'm going to rinse off my brush, dab it on my paper towel, and just start blending that out. Another thing I want to note here is that this layering technique that we just practiced, it always works much better on high quality 100% cotton paper like Arches. So if you're using student grade paper, it might be a little more challenging to get the smooth blends. You can still do it, you just have to work a little harder for it. So just blend it out there, and if you want to make this part even lighter and give it a more drastic highlight, simply rinse off your brush, dab it on your paper towel, and then just lift up some of that color. So I'm lifting it up and creating a nice highlight. So now it almost has kind of a 3D effect on that leaf petal. Now that we have practiced the actual painting technique, it's time to set up our wreath. So first things first, we need to lightly outline the circle for the wreath. So you can of course use a compass if you have one, but if not, you can really just use anything circular you have around the house to trace your circle. So I'm personally just going to trace around this small bowl that I found in my kitchen. Next up is sketching out your bigger leaves. Now, I don't always sketch everything out before painting. If you follow me on Instagram, you know most of my paintings are super loose style florals and leaves that I don't ever sketch out beforehand. But when you're working on a wreath specifically, if you don't at least plan out the bigger elements, you can sometimes end up with an awkward amount of space at the end where you either have to jam in another leaf or maybe you bunched up too many in one area without realizing it. So now I always at least plan out where my bigger leaves will go, make sure it's pretty even and balanced along the circle, and then you can always go back in and add the smaller filler leaves like these. So I'm just going to speed up this next part of the video while you work on your sketch, and just make sure to put down where you want those larger leaves to be, and then we'll meet back up to start painting. Now that we have practiced the petals and sketched out where we want all the larger leaves to be, let's start painting. I'm going to do a couple of the leaves in real time again so you can paint along with me. So once again, I'm using the size 6 Princeton brush from the Heritage series, loading up a really light value of green, and I'm just going to gently with the tip of the brush outline the stem here and lay down the color. Again, it's a very light value of green because I want to be able to add darker layers on top of it. And just like we practiced, I want this first layer to be nice and even. I don't want any pooling, but I still want it wet enough to get those bleeds and blooms when I add the second layer. So that's looking good. I'm getting a medium value of green on my brush and gently tapping it in along the side. Now to smooth out that line, I rinsed off my brush, dabbed it on the paper towel, and I gently feather it out so it can look a little smoother here. If you have too much water or you have any pooling going on, then just use a clean dry brush and let the bristles soak up some of that excess water. So now while it's still wet, I'm going to do my third round, so I'm just getting a very dark value of the green and repeating that same process along the side here. I also like the stem to be the darkest value of green, so I'm going to gently outline that stem here. Again, rinsing off my brush and feathering it out. If you want your leaves to look a little bit more abstract, you don't have to create a nice soft blend. You can just drop in some organic blooms and leave it as is. But I want mine to look a little bit more realistic. So now we have our 3 layers down, and again, I want to create a nice highlight here. So I rinsed off my brush, dried it off, and I'm lifting up some color on this side of the petal. I'm going to repeat that process again. And gently just lift up some of that color. All right, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to do one more of these in real time, same exact process, and then I'll speed up the rest. All right, so starting on the second one, I have my light wash of green, laying down the first layer. Making sure the water level is even across the whole petal. Loading up a medium value. And dropping it in along the side. And you don't have to do 3 layers like I'm doing. You can do 2, you can do more than 3 if you'd like to make it even more dramatic. I just usually do 3. Blend it out. And then going in with my third and darkest layer. And practicing this technique is a great way to practice water control, which is super important when you're painting with watercolors. So again, if you have too much water, you can soak up excess with a clean, dry brush. If you have too much, you can simply re-wet it with a nice thin layer. So now I have my darkest, and again, tapping it in. Rinsing off my brush and smoothing it out. And then creating a highlight by just using a clean, damp brush and lifting some of that color off one side of the petal. All right, that is looking pretty good. So I hope you're starting to feel more comfortable with this process. I'm going to speed up the rest of this step, but I'll just be doing this exact same thing that we just did all the way around the wreath, and then we'll meet back up again to add in our filler leaves and the finishing touches. Alright, so now all of our bigger leaves are done and the wreath is looking pretty nicely balanced, but it definitely needs some more volume, which we're going to add in now with the filler leaves. So I want you to just take a look at your wreath, identify some of the areas that are looking a little bit empty, and just go ahead and fill them in with some darker, smaller filler leaves. So now that we're moving on to the smaller filler leaves, I'm moving my brush size down to size 4. Just so I can have a little bit more control and get those dainty stems. And I'm just going to start filling in those leaves where I see empty spaces. Again, I'll do a couple in real time and then I'll speed up the rest of the process. One thing to note here, I'm not doing that same exact 3-layer technique that we did for the bigger leaves. As you can see in my reference here, they're just more of a darker, solid leaf. So that's what I'm going to be doing. They're going to be darker value, but I'm not going to do any shading or highlighting. So right off the bat, I see some open spaces here, and a couple over here. So that's where I'm going to start out. Another thing I want to mention is it's completely fine to overlap some of the leaves. It'll just give it a more full, layered look. So that's completely fine. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with my filler leaves. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm taking a size 2. This is also the Heritage Princeton brush. And I'm just getting a really dark value of the green, and I'm just going to lightly trace the outline of the circle. So most of it's already covered from the leaf stems, but a couple spots are blank here. So I'll just be tracing that to make it more complete. Alright, so that is it if you're going for the sweet and simple greenery wreath like this one. Of course, you can always keep going and make it even more complex by adding in some berries, flower buds, or other elements. Or you can even write in your favorite quote in the middle with a calligraphy brush pen. But for today, I'm just keeping it simple. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you learned some new techniques and enjoyed the painting process. A big thank you again to Princeton for collaborating with me on this video and providing all of my favorite supplies. If you want to see more, make sure to follow me on Instagram at Petals by Priya. I share a lot more painting process videos, photos, and behind the scenes content on there. I also have several in-depth watercolor classes available on Skillshare, and I'll leave a link to those in the description as well. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.